Los Angeles has a way of making certain stories feel larger than life. A person arrives here, or disappears here, dies here, and that city can turn the life into something else. It can turn it into a headline, a cautionary tale, a symbol, a piece of American mythology. That's a part of the power of Los Angeles, but it is also part of its danger. The case we're opening with tonight is one of the most famous unsolved murders in American history. It's been written about for decades. It's inspired books, films, television series, internet theories, and arguments that still continue 80 years later. People know the name, they know the mood around it, and they know the image of old Los Angeles. The newspapers, the black hair, the unsolved mystery, and the sense that something dark and unfinished is still sitting underneath the city. But the name that most people know is not the name that she was born with. Most people know Elizabeth Short as the Black Dahlia. That name's powerful, but it's also a problem. It sounds exactly like a movie title. It sounds designed for a poster. It's also making the case feel more glamorous, strange, and distant. See, a nickname? It can do exactly that. It can turn a real person into a character before the audience even knows that it's happening. Before she was the Black Dahlia, she was Elizabeth Short. She was 22 years old, she did have a family, and she moved through different places, different rooms, different friendships, different hopes. She was not a myth when she was alive, and she was not a symbol. She was not created for a future audience to debate. She was a young woman living in a country that had just come out of World War II, trying to figure out where she belonged and what kind of life might actually be available for her. And that is exactly where our episode starts tonight, guys. Not with the wildest theory and not with the most famous suspect, not with the most sensational details. We are starting with the person. Because if we don't do that, then we're already repeating one of the mistakes that made this case so distorted in the first place. The question tonight is not just who killed the Black Dahlia. Obviously, that question matters, and yes, this series will deal with it. But episode 1 has to ask something earlier, and a little more uncomfortable. What happened to Elizabeth Short after the public stopped seeing a woman and started seeing a legend? Some cases stay alive because people want justice. Other cases just stay alive because the mystery sells. And the Black Dahlia's case lives somewhere in the overlap of those two forces. A real woman was murdered. A real investigation did fail to bring a conviction. And a real family was left without answers. And then, around that real crime, a second story was built by newspapers. Rumor, speculation, police pressure, Hollywood imagination, and public fascination. The second story is the one that most people inherited. Tonight on LA Crime Files, we are going back to the beginning. Not to solve everything in one episode, and definitely not to pretend certainty where the record is unclear. We're going to go back to separate the woman from the myth. In the case, from the entertainment machine, and the known facts from the story Los Angeles keeps retelling. Welcome in, everybody. This is the Black Dahlia, the woman before the myth. Welcome to the LA Crime Files. This is the very first episode of our series here on YouTube, and we are beginning with Elizabeth Short, because her case is not only a murder case, but it's also a Los Angeles case. It's a media case. It's a case about public memory, victim blaming, institutional pressure, and the way that a city can turn a tragedy into something that people keep consuming long after the victim's been pushed out of the center. The goal of this series is not for me to cosplay the detective from my chair. It's not to take an old case and throw every theory into the wall and hope that sticks, and pretend the speculation is the same thing as investigation. There's a difference between discussing the case and exploiting the case. And there's a difference between asking the hard questions and treating the victim like a prop. LA Crime Files is going to move a little carefully. We will look at the victim, the setting, the evidence, the investigation, the media environment, the unanswered questions, and the way the case was handled over time. When something's known, we'll say it's known. When something is disputed, we will say it's disputed. And when something is a rumor, we're not going to dress it up as a fact to make our YouTube video more dramatic. That matters, especially because the Black Dahlia case has been crowded with claims for decades. There are theories about suspects. There's theories about corruption, theories about the case being connected to other famous crimes, and there's writers and researchers who truly believe that they have identified the killer. Some arguments, they're serious, a lot are thin. Some rely on genuine archival work, and others rely on coincidence, imagination, and the appeal of a dramatic ending. We're not going to sort all of that out in episode 1 because that would be the wrong order. First episode is the foundation. We need to understand Elizabeth Short before the nickname took over. We need to understand Los Angeles in the immediate post-war period. We need to understand how the discovery of her body became a national story, and how the press helped shape the image of the victim and why the unsolved nature of the case made the mythology even more powerful. The Black Dahlia is often treated like a dark Hollywood rumor, but legends have a habit of soothing over the human underneath. They make the story easier to remember and harder to tell honestly. So tonight, we're not going to begin with a theory. We're going to begin with a frame. Who was Elizabeth Short before the world renamed her? What did Los Angeles add to the story? How did a murder investigation become an American myth? And why does the case still haunt people who were born generations after it even happened? That is the file that we are opening. Elizabeth Short was born in Massachusetts in 1924. She was only 22 when she died in Los Angeles in January of 1947. Now, those two dates are extremely simple, but quite literally everything in between them has been thought about, exaggerated, moralized, reshaped by the people who came later. And that's one of the first things that we need to understand about this case. Even the basic image of Elizabeth Short has been fought over. In many older retellings, she is fitting an archetype. She became the doomed Hollywood hopeful, the mysterious woman in black, the drifter, the flirt, the tragic beauty, the girl who came out west and paid the price. Those descriptions might sound familiar because they're easy to sell. And they fit neatly into noir stories, and they also make a real person smaller. A better way to begin is to admit that Elizabeth Short was complicated in the ordinary way people were complicated. She was young, she was restless, she moved around, she wanted attention and stability. But those two desires do not always point into the same direction. She had friendships and acquaintances, and she depended on people at times. She told stories about herself. She was not always easy to pin down, and the record around her life is full of fragments. That does not make her less worthy of dignity. Actually, it makes her more human. One reason victims in famous cases get mistreated by public memory is that people start searching the victim's life for an explanation that makes the crime less random. If the victim moved around and people ask why, if the victim knew many people, people ask what that means. The victim dated, accepted rides, stayed with friends, changed plans, or told stories about herself. People began using those details like character evidence. That is not an investigation. That is a judgment disguised as investigations. And we can examine Elizabeth Short's movements without putting her on trial. We can talk about her instability, her vulnerability, and her choices without treating those things as the causes of her murder. The person responsible for her murder is the killer, and a victim's life is not a permission slip for what was done to her. That point matters because Elizabeth Short lived in a time where women were judged sharply for independence, sexuality, movement, and survival. After World War II, the country was shifting again. During the war, many women experienced new forms of work, mobility, and social freedom. After the war, there was pressure to return women to more traditional domestic roles. A young woman who moved through the cities, dated men, and took help from friends or tried to defend herself outside of a stable home could be read by the culture as suspicious before anybody even knew any facts. Now, Elizabeth Short has been described as an aspiring actress. That label was part of her public image, but it's also way more complicated than the myth suggests. Some newer coverage and research push back on the idea that she was actively building an acting career in the way that popular story claims. She was definitely close to Hollywood's orbit, and she was in a city where film culture shaped literally the entire atmosphere. But the neat version of the story, young actress comes to Hollywood and is then destroyed by the dark side of fame, may say more about Los Angeles mythology than about Elizabeth herself. That doesn't mean that she didn't have any dreams. It actually means that we should be more careful about forcing her life into the shape that the city wants. What we can say is that she was a young woman trying to make her way through an unstable period in her life. She had no permanent safety net strong enough to protect her, and she moved through temporary arrangements, temporary relationships, temporary promises, and that kind of life can make somebody vulnerable. Not because they're guilty of anything, but because instability creates exposure and puts a person in contact with strangers, more favors, more uncertainty, and more situations where trust then becomes necessary. That is the human story underneath this famous case. Not a symbol, not a warning, not a character from a crime novel, a young woman living without enough protection in a city that could be generous one minute and predatory the next. To understand why Elizabeth Short's murder became the Black Dahlia myth, you have to understand the Los Angeles around her. LA in 46 and 47 was not just palm trees and movie premieres. It was growing. It was a growing post-war city trying to absorb returning soldiers, new arrivals, gender-shifting roles, housing pressure, ambition, and anxiety. The war changed America, and LA sat at the center of several of those changes at once. Southern California had been tied to military activity, aircraft production, shipyards, entertainment, migration, and the broader sense that the West was where the new future could be built. For some people, LA looked like a door opening. For others, it became a place of temporary rooms, low money, short-term work, and social uncertainty. The same city that promised glamour also produced anonymity. You could be surrounded by people and still have no one who truly knew where you were supposed to be that night. That's one of the reasons this case is so tied to LA. The city itself did not kill Elizabeth Short, but the city shaped the conditions around her story. The movement, the anonymity, the image culture, the newspapers, the Hollywood backdrop, and the public hunger for a narrative that felt bigger than the police report. The press understood the city perfectly well. Newspapers were not passive observers. They were competing institutions with editors, deadlines, reporters, reputations, and a need for stories that would move paper. A murder involving a young woman in LA, with the Hollywood near the edge of the frame, was not going to stay small in this town. The case contained the ingredients editors understood immediately. Fear, beauty, mystery, violence in a city already associated with dreams and danger. And this is where tone matters. Saying the press sensationalized the case does not mean that the case was not serious. It was serious. The murder was absolutely horrifying, and the public had reason to be rightly disturbed. But there is a difference between a public being informed and a public being fed a mythology. A responsible newspaper can report a murder, right? Responsible newspaper can report a murder. A sensational newspaper can turn that victim into a perfect marketable image. The Black Dahlia case shows that line being completely crossed. LA also had a specific relationship with the image. The city was already trained to think in scenes. Hotels, boulevards, lobbies, photographs, headlines, movie titles, costumes, and personas. In a place like that, a nickname can spread faster than a legal name. A mood can become more powerful than a life. A story can become more memorable than a person, and that is why Elizabeth Short's murder became more than a local crime. It happened in a city prepared to turn tragedy into a direct narrative. It happened at the time when newspapers had absolute enormous power over public perception. It happened before television true crime, before internet sleuths, before podcasts, before social media. But the basic machine was already there. Attention finds a story, the story finds an image, and then the image becomes the version that the people remember. In this case, the image was the Black Dahlia. The days before Elizabeth Short's body were found were literally one of the most difficult parts of the case because they are both important and uncertain. This is where many retellings moved way too quickly. They take partial information, mix it with old accounts and repeated claims, and present them with more confidence than the record deserves. A better approach is to slow it down, and that's what we're going to do. In early January 1947, Elizabeth Short had been in Southern California and had spent time in San Diego. One key figure in the final known stretch is Robert Red Manley, a married traveling salesman who had known her and later told police that he drove her from San Diego directly to Los Angeles. The commonly repeated account is that he left her near the Biltmore Hotel in downtown LA after she was going to go meet her sister. That detail had become more famous because it creates a haunting final image. Elizabeth Short, downtown LA, suitcases dropped off, a hotel lobby, a supposed meeting, and then a gap in the record. But that gap is exactly where caution is needed. The final days before her death have been debated for decades. There's reported sightings, questioned sightings, timelines that shift depending on which account is being used, and claims that have become familiar without necessarily becoming certain. When a case becomes famous, repeated does not always mean proven. A story can be told so many times that it starts to feel official, even when the underlying evidence is weaker than the people may think. What matters for episode 1 here is not to solve every hour of that missing period. What matters is to understand what that gap did to the case. See, a gap creates narrative pressure. The public wants to fill it. Reporters, they want to explain it. And police, they want to close it. Later writers, they want to interpret it. And every unknown hour becomes an invitation. Who is she with? Where did she go? Who saw her? Who lied? And who was protecting themselves? And who got overlooked? Those are fair questions, but they need some discipline. There is difference between saying, here's what we know, and saying, here's the story that best fits the mood. The Black Dahlia's case has suffered from that difference for decades. Some people have filled the unknown with some quite serious research. Others have just filled it with fantasy. The public often struggles to tell the difference because both can sound confident. And that's why this series is going to separate those layers. The final known stretch tells us that Elizabeth Short was vulnerable, mobile, not securely anchored. It tells us that she was moving through a city where temporary context mattered. It tells us that by the time her body was discovered, investigators had a missing block of time that would become one of the most contested parts of the case. But it doesn't give us permission to invent uncertainty. For now, the important part is this. The last chapter of Elizabeth Short's life disappeared into a city of strangers, hotels, rumors, and incomplete memories. The absence helped create the myth because an unanswered question is the most powerful fuel a famous case can have. On the morning of January 15th, 1947, Elizabeth Short's body was discovered in Los Angeles. The FBI's public history of the case describes a mother walking with her child who came across the body near the sidewalk and initially thought because of how it appeared it might have been a mannequin. See, that detail is often repeated because it perfectly captures the shock of the discovery without needing to exaggerate. A residential neighborhood, a woman pushing her child, a body placed where somebody would definitely find it, in a moment where everyday Los Angeles collided with something almost impossible to process. The condition of the body immediately told investigators that this was not a simple murder scene. The FBI notes that there was absolutely no blood at the location, which indicated Elizabeth Short had likely been killed elsewhere and then moved to the site where she was found. That fact shaped the investigation directly from the beginning. The location where the body discovered was not necessarily the location of the killing. That distinction matters. A body disposal site can tell investigators something about the offender, but it can also mislead the public. People often imagine the discovery location as the center of the crime because that's where the story became visible. But the real chain of events began earlier, somewhere else, with somebody who had control of Elizabeth before she was placed in that lot. The nature of the mutilation also shaped early thinking. Investigators considered whether the person responsible might have had some anatomical knowledge or skill. The FBI's account says agents were asked to check students at the University of Southern California Medical School because of suspicions that the killer might have had dissection skills. It doesn't prove that the killer was a doctor or medical student. It just shows that investigators, they considered something based on what they saw. And see, this is an important example of how legitimate investigative questioning can become a mythology engine. Once the public hears that investigators wondered about a medical skill, the story can grow into stronger claims that evidence supports. Suddenly, the killer becomes a surgeon, a doctor, a genius, a monster with precise expertise. Maybe that is true. Maybe it's not. The responsible version is narrow, however. Investigators saw something that made them examine people with possible anatomical training. And that is enough. The discovery created immediate pressure. Police had to identify the victim, preserve the evidence, follow leads, deal with the reporters, and reassure a city that knew now a horrific murder had happened. The public wanted answers. Newspapers, they wanted details. Investigators, they were trying to build a case in an atmosphere that was already becoming unstable. The first few hours of a homicide investigation matter, and in this case, those hours unfolded in the middle of a city ready to turn that crime into a headline. One of the most concrete parts of the early investigation is how Elizabeth Short was identified. The LAPD led the investigation, but the FBI assisted. And according to the FBI's history of the case, blurred fingerprints were transmitted from LA using sound photo, which was an early image transmission system used by news services. The FBI identified Elizabeth Short very, very quickly after receiving those prints. The Bureau's own account says that it only took them 56 minutes. And that detail matters because it shows how modern the investigation could be for its time and how limited it still was. Investigators were using any and all available technology to move fast, but they were still living in 1947. There was no DNA database, no cell phones, no cell phone trail, no surveillance network, no digital transactions mapping a person's movement, no internet search history, no social media messages, and the case depended entirely on physical evidence, witnesses, records, interviews, memory, paper trails, and shoe leather police work. Elizabeth Short's fingerprints were already in the FBI files for two reasons. The FBI says she applied to work at the commissary at Camp Cook in California in 1943. And she had been arrested in Santa Barbara for underage drinking later that year. Those records help identify her after her death. There is something bleak about that. Small bureaucratic traces from a young woman's life became the way authorities put a name back onto her body. The FBI then helped by the LAPD by running record checks and conducting interviews around the country. The Bureau also searched for a fingerprint match on an anonymous letter that might have been connected to the case. But according to its public account, those prints were not found in FBI files. Those facts show the scale of the investigation and also the frustration. The system could identify Elizabeth Short quickly, but it could also gather records, it could check names, it could check leads. But identification is not the same as justice. Knowing who the victim is does not tell you who killed her. The case would soon become buried under leads, confessions, letters, rumors, suspects, and pressure. But in this early moment, there's a clear sequence. A body discovered, fingerprints set, the victim identified, investigators mobilized. The problem was not that nobody knew the case mattered. Everybody knew it mattered almost immediately. The problem was that the attention, it came with a cost. The press did not kill Elizabeth Short, but the press played a major role in creating the Black Dahlia as the public came to know her. The distinction is central to our episode tonight. A killer ended Elizabeth Short's life, and the media shaped the afterlife of her story. The nickname itself is part of that afterlife. FBI material says she was later dubbed the Black Dahlia by press, tied to rumors about black clothing in the film The Blue Dahlia. Los Angeles Times coverage has explored how the nickname connected to noir fantasy, how it might have grown out of Long Beach drugstore settings, and how there's no proof Elizabeth Short even knew the name in the way later culture imagines. That last part's important. See, a nickname can feel personal because the public repeats it for decades, but it doesn't mean that it ever belonged to the person. In Elizabeth Short's case, the nickname became more famous than her actual name. It actually shaped how people pictured her. It gave the case a mood before people even understood any of the facts. Once she became the Black Dahlia, the story became then easier to market. The name carried darkness, beauty, danger, and the mystery in words. It made a murder sound like a noir object. And the more memorable the name became, the easier it was for the person underneath to entirely disappear. And that is how media framing works. It doesn't always lie directly. Sometimes it selects a version of a person and repeats that version until it becomes the only one the public knows. Elizabeth Short was turned into a type. The doomed young woman in black connected to Hollywood, drifting near glamour, destroyed by the city's dark side. That version had power because it fit what the public already wanted to believe about LA. It let people talk about the case as a morality play. The dream factory has shadows. The city eats its young and danger hides under its belly. Those themes are not completely false. LA does have shadows, and Hollywood did create illusions. Young women were entirely vulnerable in a city full of ambition and exploitation. But the theme can become dangerous when it takes over the person. When the press covered Elizabeth Short, the story did not remain fixed on the fact that a young woman had been murdered. It shifted towards who she supposedly was, what she supposedly wanted, and how she supposedly dressed, what kind of woman she supposedly represented. Her image became contested terrain. And that matters entirely because public memory affects the investigation and its legacy. If the victim is framed as reckless, mysterious, seductive, or morally suspect, the public then becomes less focused on the violence done to her and more focused on whether her life somehow invited that danger. It is a subtle form of victim blaming, and it has followed this case for generations. A victim can be imperfect and still be a victim. A victim can be unstable and still be a victim. A victim can make risky choices and still deserve justice. The crime is the crime. The media's failure was not only that it made the case famous. Fame can keep a case alive. The deeper failure was that the fame came attached to an image that often swallowed Elizabeth Short's humanity. After the murder, the case drew letters, notes, supposed clues, even confessions, and attention from people who wanted to desperately be near the story. The LA Public Library's archival materials document that police and newspapers received various letters and notes claiming to provide information to help solve the case. One record describes an envelope sent to LA Herald and Express, mailed on January 28, 1947, containing what became as a yes or no note. That kind of material helped keep the case in motion publicly, gave newspapers much more to report, and it gave the public the sense that the killer or somebody pretending to be the killer might be communicating. It created a feedback loop between crime, media, police, and an audience. Famous cases attract people for different reasons. Some people genuinely think that they know something. Some want attention. Some are mentally unstable. Some are trying to insert themselves directly into history as they see it. Some might even be testing police. Some might be lying. Some might be telling just partial truths. And investigators have to sort through all of that, while the public only gets to see fragments. That's one reason why high-profile investigations can become so difficult. Every tip has to be evaluated, every confession tested, every object sent to a newspaper or police department has to be treated extremely carefully. Not because it's automatically meaningful, but because it could be. Time spent on false leads is not time spent on a real one. But investigators do not always know which is which at the very beginning. The Black Dahlia case became a stage immediately. That is the right word for this, a stage. The murder was the event, but once newspapers and public obsession took hold, people began stepping into the spotlight around it. Reporters, detectives, supposed witnesses, fake confessors, later authorities, amateur sleuths, retired investigators, and theorists, they all became part of the larger story. And it doesn't mean that everybody who studied this case has acted in bad faith. Some research has been careful and extremely serious. But the overall fact was that Elizabeth Short's murder became a public arena. People could argue it, profit from it, build reputations on it, or even use it to support larger stories about Hollywood, LA corruption, sexuality, or even evil. The attention helped keep the case from being forgotten, though, and that is the positive side, but attention without discipline can also bury that case under noise. And that is a major lesson for the LA crime files. Public attention is not automatically justice. Sometimes public attention is just another form of consumption. It keeps saying that the victim's name while slowly replacing the victim with the audience's fascination. In many retellings, Elizabeth Short became less a victim than a warning, and she becomes the girl who wanted too much, trusted too easily, dressed too darkly, stayed out too late, knew too many men, or got too close to the wrong city. And that framing can feel like an explanation, but it usually functions as blame. It is important to say this plainly. None of those narratives have solved Elizabeth Short's murder. They do something else, though. They do make the public feel that the world is more comfortable than it is. If a victim can be turned into someone who made wrong choices, then the audience can imagine that safety is simply a matter of being different from her. That is psychologically comforting, but it's entirely unfair. The true crime genre has repeated that pattern way too often, especially with female victims. A victim's clothes, their relationships, sexuality, ambition, and social life have become a part of the entertainment. The audience is invited to inspect her, and that inspection gets mistaken for understanding. Elizabeth Short was especially vulnerable to that treatment because her case sat at the intersection of sex, youth, beauty, LA, Hollywood, and murder. Those ingredients then gave journalists and later storytellers way too many opportunities to turn her into a familiar character. The femme fatale, the broken dreamer, the dangerous flirt, or the doomed beauty. But a person is not an archetype. The more closely that you look at Elizabeth Short, the less useful that archetype actually becomes. She appears less like a noir figure and more like a young woman trying to survive uncertainty. She had charm, but charm's not guilt. She depended on others at times, but dependence is not guilt. And she might have told stories about herself, but young people often invent versions of themselves when they're searching for stability, sympathy, or even identity. The question should not be, how do we turn those details against her? The question should be, what kind of world was she moving through? And how did that world respond after she was killed? That response then reveals a lot. It reveals how quickly a woman's life can be sexualized after death. It reveals how easily a newspaper can reshape a victim to fit a headline. It reveals how mystery can become more marketable when the victim is made to seem both beautiful and morally questionable. That's not justice, that is storytelling at the expense of the dead. LA Crime Files cannot undo 80 years of myth making, but it can refuse to repeat the easiest version. The Black Dahlia myth lasted because it had several forms of power working together. First, the case was genuinely horrifying. The public response was not manufactured from nothing, and a young woman had been murdered in an extremely brutal way, and no one was ever held accountable. That alone would have caused and created fear and attention. Second, the case had an immediate visual and narrative hook. A young woman, Los Angeles, post-war Hollywood, a nickname connected to darkness and beauty, and a violent unresolved death in the absence of closure are all combined into a story people could remember easily. Third, the case arrived in a media environment where newspapers could still dominate public attention. A sensational story could travel through headlines, front pages, photo columns, and rumor before the facts had settled. Once a public image formed, it then became difficult to reverse. Fourth, the case became useful to broader stories people already told about LA. It could be used as proof that Hollywood dreams were dangerous. It could be used as proof that the city was corrupt, seductive, lonely, predatory, and morally shallow. The case became a container for anxieties that were bigger than Elizabeth Short. And fifth, the case remained unresolved. That might be the most important piece. Closure ends certain kinds of speculation. It doesn't end grief, and it definitely does not erase the public's interest, but it can narrow the field. An unresolved case remains open space. People can keep entertaining it, a writer can propose a suspect, a retired detective can point to a family member even. A researcher can connect it to another crime, and a new theory can revive public interest every decade. The absence of an official answer became part of this case's power. This is the uncomfortable truth. The public says it wants closure, but the culture of true crime often feeds on the lack of closure here. Mystery keeps the story alive. Mystery makes people return. Mystery allows each generation to believe that it might be the one to finally see what everybody else might have missed. There's nothing wrong with wanting answers here, but there's something wrong when the desire for answers turns into ownership over a victim's story. Elizabeth Short has belonged to too many people for too long. Newspapers, novelists, filmmakers, theorists, internet boards, and audiences who know the nickname better than a woman. This episode is not an attempt to own the story. It's an attempt to put the order back where it belongs. The victim comes first, the mystery second. The central question of this episode is absolutely simple. Did the Black Dahlia case stay alive because people wanted justice, or because the mythology became too powerful to let it go? The honest answer here is actually probably both. You see, there's people who have cared about Elizabeth Short as a victim. There are researchers who have seriously worked through old documents. There are journalists who've tried to separate the fact from the fiction. There are writers who've challenged the victim blaming and tried to restore her humanity. And every ounce of that work matters. But there's another side. The case also stayed alive because, honestly, it's marketable. The name is marketable. The mood is marketable. The lack of an answer is marketable. Los Angeles itself is marketable. A story about a young woman murdered in the shadow of Hollywood has a dark pull that the culture keeps returning to. And that's why true crime has to be handled with a standard. A case can be discussed without being exploited. A victim can be remembered without being flattened. The public can ask questions without pretending every theory deserves equal weight. A host can acknowledge uncertainty without filling the silence with drama. For RSR Media, that's the point of LA Crime Files. We are not doing this series to make death look cool. We're doing it because crime stories reveal systems, media systems, policing, city systems, cultural, and the way public memory can either honor or distort that victim. The Black Dahlia belongs here because it is not only about who killed Elizabeth Short, it's about what happened after she died, how the press behaved. It's about how the investigators operated under pressure. It's about how women were judged. It's about how a city built on image helped create an image that outlived the women. That does not solve the case, but it does make us better prepared to talk about it honestly. Episode 2 can go deeper into the crime scene, the early investigation, the police's decisions, the press pressure, and the specific leads that help shape the case. Episode 3 can deal with the suspects and theories, but this first episode has to build the foundation. If we skip the foundation, we turn Elizabeth Short into an opening scene before the real entertainment begins. And that is exactly what this series is refusing to do. Before she was the Black Dahlia, she was Elizabeth Short. That sentence is simple, but it changes the way the case should be handled. It reminds us that a nickname is not a person, a headline is not a life, a photograph is not a full biography, and a theory is not justice. And a famous murder case is still at its center a human's loss. Elizabeth Short was 22 years old when her life ended. The world had spent nearly 80 years arguing about what happened to her. But too often the argument has been louder than the person. The public remembers a mystery, the darkness, the unanswered questions, the old LA atmosphere. But remembering that atmosphere is not the same as remembering the victim. That's why episode 1 of LA Crime Files starts right here. Not with certainty we don't have. Not with a suspect we are not ready to argue. Not with a theory dressed up as a verdict, and we start with the woman, the city, the media, and the myth. The Black Dahlia case is a warning about what can happen when tragedy becomes a story before justice even catches up. That story becomes profitable, and the victim becomes symbolic. The public then becomes fascinated, and the absence of closure becomes a part of the entertainment. But we don't have to repeat that without questioning it. We can still ask what happened. We can still examine the investigation. We can still study the suspects. We can still look at all the letters, the leads, the crime scene, the police work, and the theories. But we have to do it in the right order. The victim first, the theories second, the facts third. That's the standard for our series. The next episode we go into January 15th, 1947 in a little bit more detail. The discovery, the disposal site, the first investigative decisions, the early media coverage and how the case began to move from homicide investigation into public spectacle. This is the LA Crime Files. I am your host, Chase, and this is RSR Media. Same room, bigger mission. Signal over noise.